I found out my sister married my fiancé while I was deployed in Afghanistan through a Facebook notification at 3 a.m. in a combat outpost outside Kandahar. What I discovered when I got home wasn't just betrayal. It was a systematic conspiracy involving forged documents, stolen military benefits, and fraud that my family had been planning since the day I shipped out. But the military lawyer who helped me destroy their lives had receipts going back 3 years. And what we found made their betrayal look like a children's game compared to the federal crimes they'd committed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Captain Jessica Rodriguez, and if you're watching this, prepare yourself for a story about family loyalty, military honor, and how the people you trust most can become your deadliest enemies. Have you ever served your country overseas only to come home and discover your entire life has been stolen by the people who were supposed to protect it? Have you ever been betrayed so completely that it required federal prosecutors and military justice to set things right? Because that's exactly what happened to me during my 9-month deployment to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. And what came after? The investigation, the arrests, the complete destruction of everything my sister and fiancé thought they'd built on my stolen identity. That's what finally taught me the difference between family and blood relatives. But let me take you back to that night in the desert when my world exploded, because understanding the magnitude of their betrayal requires knowing what I was fighting for while they were busy stealing everything I'd worked to build. March 15th, 2023, 0300 hours local time. I was pulling communications duty at our outpost, monitoring radio traffic and coordinating with intelligence units across the region. It was routine work, the kind of quiet night shift that let you catch up on emails and check social media when operational security allowed. I'd been deployed for 6 months by then, part of a specialized military intelligence unit working to identify and disrupt Taliban supply networks. The work was dangerous but important, and I was proud to be serving alongside some of the best soldiers in the Army. My unit respected my analytical skills and my ability to build relationships with local informants who provided crucial intelligence. Home felt a million miles away, but I kept it close through daily emails with my fiancé David Chen, weekly video calls with my family, and the constant stream of wedding planning details that my sister Lucy was helping coordinate while I was overseas. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. David and I had been engaged for 18 months before my deployment. He was a software engineer in Austin, Texas, where we'd been planning to settle after I completed my military service. We'd bought a house together in 2022, a beautiful 3-bedroom place in Cedar Park that represented everything we'd dreamed about building together. Lucy had been my maid of honor, my closest confidant, the sister who'd supported my military career even when our parents had doubts about their daughter choosing such a dangerous profession. She was 2 years younger than my 28, but she'd always been the responsible one, the family mediator who kept everyone connected and informed. When I deployed to Afghanistan, Lucy had volunteered to help David with wedding preparations, house maintenance, and all the domestic details that deployment made impossible for me to manage from 8,000 miles away. David had been struggling with the separation, but our daily communications had been positive and supportive. He sent care packages, wrote long emails about his work projects and our future plans, and never missed our scheduled video calls. Every conversation reinforced my belief that our relationship was strong enough to survive deployment and that coming home to him would make all the sacrifice worthwhile. Lucy's updates were equally reassuring. She sent photos of house maintenance projects, forwarded mail that needed my attention, and provided detailed reports on wedding vendor meetings and planning decisions. She seemed genuinely excited about my upcoming return and the wedding ceremony we'd scheduled for 2 months after my deployment ended. That's what made the Facebook notification so devastating. I was scrolling through social media during a brief connectivity window when the notification popped up. Lucy Rodriguez is now married to David Chen. The timestamp showed the post was from 6 hours earlier, which meant they'd gotten married in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon while I was sleeping in my bunk after an 18-hour intelligence gathering mission. For a moment, I thought this was some kind of technical error or social media glitch. There was no way my sister had married my fiancé. It was impossible, unthinkable, the kind of betrayal that existed in soap operas but not in real military families who understood honor and loyalty. I tried calling David immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I tried calling Lucy with the same result. I tried calling my parents, but it was 2 a.m. in Texas, and they didn't answer. For the next 4 hours, I sat in that communications bunker in Afghanistan, frantically trying to reach someone who could explain what the hell was happening to my life. Finally, at 7 a.m. Texas time, Lucy answered her phone. "Jess!" Her voice was bright and cheerful, like she was genuinely happy to hear from me. "How are you doing? How's the deployment going?" "Lucy," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite the rage and confusion consuming me, "I saw the Facebook photos. What the fuck is going on?" There was a pause, then a sigh that sounded more annoyed than apologetic. "Oh, that. Yeah, I was going to call you today and explain. David and well, things just developed naturally while you've been gone. We realized we're perfect for each other, and we didn't want to wait anymore." The casual tone, the complete lack of shame or remorse, the way she spoke about stealing my fiancé like it was a minor scheduling change, it was almost more shocking than the betrayal itself. "You married my fiancé, Lucy. The man I'm engaged to, the man I'm planning to marry when I get home in 3 months." "We're planning to marry," she corrected. "But let's be honest, Jess. Long-distance relationships don't work, especially military ones. David was lonely, I was helping him with everything anyway, and we just connected. It's better this way. You'll understand when you get home and see how happy we are together." Better this way? Like my heart being ripped out with some kind of favor they were doing me? "Where's my engagement ring, Lucy? The one David proposed with?" "I'm wearing it. David gave it to me when he proposed last month. He said it belonged with someone who could actually be there for him." I ended the call before I said something that would compromise operational security or get me in trouble with my command. But I immediately started making other calls, trying to understand the scope of what Lucy and David had done while I was serving my country in a combat zone. What I discovered over the next several hours made the marriage seem like a minor betrayal compared to the systematic fraud they'd been committing while I was serving my country. The house David and I had bought together, the house I'd been making mortgage payments on through automatic deduction from my military pay, had been refinanced in February. Lucy, using the power of attorney I'd given her for emergencies, had signed documents transferring my ownership stake to David. The refinancing had pulled out $80,000 in equity, money that had apparently funded their new life together. The joint bank account I shared with David, which contained my deployment savings and the hazard pay bonus I'd been accumulating to fund our wedding and honeymoon, had been emptied. Every penny of the $45,000 I'd saved over 6 months of combat duty was gone. Most devastatingly, someone had been filing false military family support claims using my service record and David's information as my dependent spouse. The Military Family Support Office had been sending monthly payments to support David during my deployment, money that was supposed to help military families manage the financial challenges of deployment separation. But David wasn't my dependent spouse anymore. He was married to my sister, which meant the family support payments were fraudulent, and continuing to collect them while married to someone else was a federal crime. I spent the rest of that day making calls to banks, lawyers, and military family services, trying to understand how much damage Lucy and David had done and whether any of it could be reversed. What I discovered was that they'd been planning this betrayal for months, systematically positioning themselves to steal everything I owned while I was deployed and unable to monitor or prevent their activities. The power of attorney Lucy had convinced me to sign wasn't just for emergencies. It included broad financial authority that she'd use to access my accounts, sign legal documents, and make decisions about property I owned. She'd presented the document to banks and lawyers as evidence that I'd authorized her to act on my behalf in all financial matters. David had used his status as my fiancé to access benefits and support services intended for military families, collecting thousands of dollars in assistance while secretly planning to marry my sister. He'd also used his access to my...
Captain, I want you to understand that cases like this aren't unusual. There's a pattern of family members and romantic partners who target deployed service members specifically because deployment makes it difficult to monitor or prevent financial fraud. What your sister and fiancé have done follows a template that suggests this might not be their first time committing these types of crimes. The implication was staggering. Lucy and David hadn't just betrayed me on impulse or because they'd fallen in love. They'd executed a sophisticated financial fraud scheme that targeted my military service and deployment status, using my absence to steal everything I'd worked to build. Captain Santos recommended that I document everything, preserve all communications, and prepare for a full criminal investigation once I returned from deployment. She also advised me to immediately revoke all powers of attorney, freeze my remaining financial accounts, and notify military family services that David was no longer my dependent. But most importantly, she told me that the military justice system took these crimes very seriously, especially when they targeted deployed service members who were serving in combat zones. The people who do this think deployment makes service members vulnerable and helpless, Captain Santos said. They're counting on the fact that you're 8,000 miles away and focused on staying alive. What they don't understand is that the military legal system is specifically designed to protect service members from exactly this type of exploitation. Over the following weeks, as I continued my deployment duties while working with Captain Santos to document the fraud, I discovered that Lucy and David's betrayal was even more systematic and calculating than I had initially understood. They hadn't just gotten married and stolen my money. They'd created an entire false narrative about my military service and my relationship with David, using that narrative to justify their actions and access benefits and sympathy they weren't entitled to receive. Lucy had been telling our family and mutual friends that David and I had broken up before my deployment, that I'd encouraged him to move on and find happiness with someone who could be there for him. She'd presented herself as the caring sister who was helping David heal from a difficult breakup, rather than the predator who'd systematically stolen her sister's life. David had been telling his family and coworkers that I'd changed during military service, become distant and career-focused, and had essentially abandoned our relationship for my military ambitions. He'd painted himself as the loyal partner who'd waited as long as possible before finally accepting that I was more committed to the Army than to our future together. Both narratives were complete lies, but they'd been crafted carefully to make Lucy and David appear sympathetic while making me seem like the selfish service member who'd chosen career over family. They'd use these lies to justify their marriage, their theft of my assets, and their fraudulent claims for military family benefits. But what they didn't know was that military lawyers are trained to recognize these patterns, and the evidence of their crimes was documented in ways they'd never anticipated. Every power of attorney transaction was recorded, every military family support payment was tracked, Every communication they'd had with banks, lawyers, and government agencies was preserved in databases that Captain Santos could access with proper legal authority. Lucy and David thought they'd committed the perfect crime, exploiting a deployed service member who was too far away and too distracted by combat duties to protect herself. What they'd actually done was create a comprehensive paper trail of federal crimes that would be easily prosecuted once I returned from deployment. Captain Santos had the receipts, and she was looking forward to destroying their lives just as systematically as they'd tried to destroy mine. Standing in that communications bunker in Afghanistan, 8,000 miles from home, I realized that Lucy and David's betrayal had given me something more valuable than the money they'd stolen or the house they'd taken. It had given me absolute moral clarity about who they really were and what they deserved. I was going to finish my deployment with honor, serve my remaining time with distinction, and then return home to watch the military justice system teach my sister and former fiancé exactly what happens to people who prey on deployed service members. The war in Afghanistan would end for me in 3 months. But the war against Lucy and David was just beginning, and I had the full power of the United States military legal system on my side. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming for them. What I didn't understand during those first devastating phone calls from Afghanistan was that Lucy hadn't just stolen my fiancé and my money, she'd been systematically destroying my relationships and reputation for 2 years, positioning herself to take over my entire life the moment I deployed. But the pattern went back even further than that, all the way to my decision to join the military, when Lucy realized that my success was threatening the golden child status she'd enjoyed our entire childhood. Growing up in San Antonio, Texas, Lucy and I had been inseparable as children, but everything changed when I started excelling academically and she began struggling in school. I was the older sister who made honor roll every semester, earned a full scholarship to Texas A&M, and graduated with a degree in computer science and a commission.
Our parents, Carlos and Carmen Rodriguez, had always treated Lucy as the family princess. She was the daughter who stayed close to home, who called every day, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries without prompting. I was the daughter who'd chosen a demanding career that took me away from family gatherings and holiday celebrations, who sent money instead of spending time, who loved our family but couldn't always prioritize their expectations over my military obligations. Lucy's such a good daughter, I'd heard Mom tell neighbors countless times. She's always thinking about family first. Jessica's accomplished, of course, but she's so focused on her career. Sometimes I wonder if all that military training makes her too independent for her own good. Even then, I recognized the subtle undermining. Lucy wasn't more caring or family-oriented. She was manipulative and calculating. She'd learned early that positioning herself as the devoted daughter created opportunities to control family narratives while making me look selfish for pursuing my own goals. But I didn't understand the full scope of her manipulation until I started investigating her activities during my deployment. What I discovered was a 15-year pattern of sabotage, relationship interference, and systematic reputation destruction that had been building toward the ultimate theft of my entire adult life. The pattern started in high school, when Lucy began spreading rumors that I was stuck up and thought I was better than everyone because I focused on academics instead of social activities. She'd tell our mutual friends that I criticized their choices, looked down on their interests, and considered myself superior because of my grades and college ambitions. None of it was true, but Lucy was gifted at presenting lies in ways that sounded like concerned observations. I love Jessica, but sometimes she says things that make people feel bad about themselves, she'd tell friends, creating doubt about my character while positioning herself as the caring sister who had to make excuses for my supposed arrogance. The sabotage escalated during college when Lucy convinced several of my high school friends that I'd become too good for them because I was pursuing a military commission.
She'd share carefully edited versions of my letters home, emphasizing any comments about academic challenges or leadership training while omitting context that showed I was simply sharing my experiences. Jessica writes these letters about how hard her classes are and how demanding her professors are. It's like she wants us to know how much smarter she is than everyone who stayed home for regular college. But I hadn't been bragging about academic challenges. I'd been sharing my struggles and asking for emotional support from family and friends. Lucy had taken my vulnerability and reframed it as arrogance, slowly poisoning my relationships while presenting herself as the humble sister who stayed grounded despite having such an ambitious sibling. The pattern continued after I graduated and received my first military assignment at Fort Hood, Texas. Lucy would visit me on base occasionally, but she spent most of those visits collecting information about my lifestyle, my salary, my benefits, and my future plans. At the time, I thought she was genuinely interested in my career and proud of my accomplishments. What I discovered later was that Lucy had been using those visits to build detailed knowledge about military life, deployment schedules, family support systems, and the legal protections available to service members. She wasn't learning about my career out of sisterly interest. She was conducting reconnaissance for future exploitation. When I started dating David in 2019, Lucy immediately inserted herself into our relationship. She wanted to meet him right away, offered to help with party planning and social events, and made herself indispensable as the family member who could bridge any communication gaps between David and our parents. David loved Lucy's attention and support. He was an only child from a quiet family, and Lucy's warmth and enthusiasm made him feel like welcomed into a large, loving, extended family. She remembered his birthday, asked about his work projects, and included him in family activities even when I was away on training assignments. "Your sister is amazing," David would tell me after family gatherings. "She makes me feel like I've been part of your family forever. I'm so lucky to have such a caring sister-in-law." But Lucy's interest in David wasn't sisterly affection, it was strategic positioning. She was building a relationship with my boyfriend that would give her access to information about our plans, our finances, and our vulnerabilities. More importantly, she was establishing herself as David's advocate and support system, creating emotional dependence that she could later exploit. The manipulation became more sophisticated after David and I got engaged in 2021. Lucy volunteered to help with wedding planning, positioning herself as the maid of honor who would handle details while I focused on my military responsibilities. She attended venue visits, met with vendors, and coordinated logistics that engagement required. But Lucy wasn't just helping with wedding planning, she was building relationships with every vendor, venue coordinator, and service provider involved in our ceremony. She presented herself as my authorized representative, established credit in my name for wedding expenses, and created financial obligations that I would be legally. David, meanwhile, was being gradually alienated from his own family and friend networks. Lucy would suggest that his family didn't understand military life and couldn't provide the support he needed during my deployment. She'd point out that his friends were mostly single and wouldn't relate to the challenges of maintaining a relationship with a deployed service member. "You need people around you who understand what you're going through," Lucy would tell David. "Jessica's deployment is going to be hard on both of you, but I'll make sure you have the support you need." Lucy was isolating David from his natural support systems while positioning herself as his primary emotional resource. By the time I deployed to Afghanistan in September 2022, David was more dependent on Lucy for emotional support and practical assistance than he was on his own family or longtime friends. But the most insidious aspect of Lucy's manipulation was how she'd been rewriting the history of our relationship with David, creating false narratives that would justify their eventual betrayal. Lucy would tell David stories about my previous relationships that were either completely fabricated or heavily distorted versions of normal dating experiences. She'd suggest that I had a pattern of putting military career ahead of personal relationships, that I'd abandoned previous boyfriends when military obligations conflicted with their needs. Jessica's always been career-focused, Lucy would tell David during my training absences. I love her, but she's never learned how to balance military life with personal relationships. I've seen her do this before. She gets so caught up in being a soldier that she forgets about the people who need her at home. None of this was true. I'd had normal college relationships that ended for typical reasons: career changes, geographical moves, simple incompatibility. But Lucy had reframed every relationship as evidence that I was emotionally unavailable and incapable of prioritizing personal commitments over professional ambitions. She also began planting seeds of doubt about my commitment to our shared future. Lucy would tell David that I'd made comments about keeping my options open after military service, that I'd expressed uncertainty about settling down in Texas, that I'd worried about whether civilian life would be exciting enough after years of military adventure. Again, none of it was true. I'd been completely committed to building a life with David in Austin, starting a family after military service, and transitioning to civilian career that would allow us to grow old together. But Lucy had created an alternative narrative where I was secretly planning to abandon David as soon as my military obligations ended. Most devastatingly, Lucy had been intercepting and filtering my communications with David during the months leading up to my deployment. She'd convinced David to share his concerns about our relationship with her, promising to translate his feelings in ways that wouldn't upset me while I was preparing for combat deployment. But instead of facilitating communication between David and me, Lucy was managing it. She'd tell David that I was too stressed to handle relationship discussions, that bringing up his concerns would distract me from crucial pre-deployment training, that she would find better ways to address his needs while keeping our relationship strong. David, who genuinely loved me and wanted to support my military service, accepted Lucy's guidance because he trusted her and believed she understood military culture better than he did. He had no idea that Lucy was using his trust to create emotional distance between us while positioning herself as his primary source of relationship advice and emotional support. By the time I deployed to Afghanistan in September 2022, Lucy had spent 3 years systematically undermining my relationship with David, accessing my financial accounts, creating fraudulent credit obligations, and building the infrastructure necessary to steal my entire life while I was serving in a combat zone. But Lucy's plan was even more sophisticated than simple theft and romantic betrayal. She'd been documenting every aspect of my military service, my financial situation, and my personal relationships, creating detailed records that would allow her to impersonate me for legal and financial purposes. Lucy had copies of my military ID, my social security card, my passport, and my driver's license. She had access to my bank accounts, my credit reports, and my military family support documentation. She knew my passwords, my security questions, and my digital signatures well enough to forge documents that would pass casual inspection. Most importantly, Lucy had been building relationships with every person and institution that David and I interacted with: our bank, our mortgage company, our insurance agents, our wedding vendors, even our neighbors and mutual friends. She'd positioned herself as my authorized representative and trusted family contact, creating a network of people who would accept her authority to act on my behalf. When I deployed to Afghanistan, Lucy didn't just steal my fiancé and my money, she stole my entire identity. She had the access, the documentation, and the social relationships necessary to become Jessica Rodriguez for legal and financial purposes, while I was 8,000 miles away and unable to monitor or prevent her activities. The marriage to David wasn't just romantic betrayal, it was the final step in a comprehensive identity theft scheme that Lucy had been planning for years. By marrying David, Lucy gained access to military spouse benefits, joint financial accounts, and legal authority over assets that would have been harder to steal while I was deployed and David remained my fiancé.
But what Lucy didn't understand is that military lawyers are trained to recognize exactly these patterns of deployed service member exploitation, and every step she had taken to steal my life had created evidence that would eventually destroy hers. The power of attorney documents she'd convinced me to sign were recorded and timestamped. The financial transactions she'd conducted using my identity were tracked and monitored. The benefits she'd claimed fraudulently were documented and auditable. The relationships she'd built with my vendors and service providers had created witnesses who could testify about her systematic impersonation.
Lucy thought she'd executed the perfect crime, exploiting my deployment and David's loneliness to steal everything I'd worked to build while creating narratives that made her appear sympathetic and me appear negligent. What she'd actually done was create a comprehensive paper trail of federal crimes that would be easily prosecuted once military investigators started examining her activities. Standing in that communications bunker in Afghanistan, processing the magnitude of Lucy's betrayal, I realized that her theft of my fiancé and my money was just the visible tip of an iceberg that included years of systematic sabotage, relationship manipulation, and identity theft. Lucy hadn't just stolen my present, she'd been stealing my future for years, positioning herself to take over my entire life the moment I became vulnerable to exploitation through military deployment. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd targeted a United States military officer who was trained in intelligence gathering, documentation, and strategic planning. And she'd committed federal crimes against a deployed service member, which meant the full power of military justice system would be brought to bear on her destruction. The devoted sister who'd been protecting everyone from my supposed selfishness was about to discover what happens to people who prey on American soldiers serving in combat zones. The breakthrough that would destroy Lucy and David's lives came from an unexpected source: a routine audit of military family support payments that Captain Santos had requested as part of standard legal due diligence. What that audit revealed wasn't just the fraud I'd suspected, but a sophisticated identity theft operation that had tentacles reaching into 3 different federal agencies and involved crimes worth over $200,000. "Captain Rodriguez," Captain Santos said during our secure video call 3 weeks after I'd first contacted her, "I need you to sit down for this conversation. What we've uncovered goes far beyond relationship betrayal or even simple financial fraud. Your sister has been impersonating you for federal benefit purposes, and the evidence suggests this is part of a larger criminal network." I was in my bunk at the outpost, having just completed a 14-hour intelligence mission that had resulted in the capture of 3 Taliban weapons smugglers. I was exhausted, emotionally drained from weeks of processing Lucy and David's betrayal, and unprepared for what Captain Santos was about to tell me. The military family support audit revealed that someone has been claiming benefits for multiple deployed service members. Your sister's name appears as the designated family contact and benefit recipient for at least 4 different military personnel over the past 2 years. My blood went cold. Lucy hadn't just targeted me, she had been systematically exploiting multiple deployed service members, using her knowledge of military systems to commit fraud on a scale that made my situation seem small in comparison. "Captain Santos, are you saying Lucy has done this before?" "I'm saying your sister appears to be part of an organized scheme that specifically targets military families for identity theft and benefit fraud. The other cases we've identified show the same pattern: power of attorney documents, romantic relationship with the service member's partner, systematic financial theft, and fraudulent benefit claims." Captain Santos shared her screen to show me a flowchart that looked like something from a federal organized crime investigation. Lucy's name was at the center, connected to 4 other military personnel, their romantic partners, and a web of financial institutions, benefit agencies, and legal document services. "The patterns are too consistent to be coincidental," Captain Santos explained. "Same types of power of attorney language, same progression from authorized user to account takeover, same timing of romantic relationship development with the deployed person's partner." She clicked through evidence files that showed Lucy's involvement in cases dating back to 2019. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, deployed to Iraq, whose girlfriend had married Lucy's roommate while systematically draining his savings account.
Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, deployed to Syria, whose fiancé had been convinced by Lucy's cousin to refinance their jointly owned house and disappear with the equity. In each case, Lucy had used a slightly different identity and relationship to the victims, but the methods were identical. She'd gain the trust of deployed service members through family or social connections, obtain limited power of attorney for specific purposes, then expand that authority to commit systematic theft while the service members were unable to monitor or prevent her activities. The sophistication level suggests professional criminal organization, Captain Santos said. Your sister isn't just an opportunistic family member who saw a chance to steal from you. She's part of a network that specifically targets military families for exploitation. But the most shocking revelation was still coming. Captain Rodriguez, we've discovered that your sister has been using your military service record to claim benefits with multiple federal agencies. She's been receiving Social Security disability payments in your name, claiming you were injured during a training accident in 2020. She's been collecting unemployment benefits, stating that you were medically discharged and unable to work. She's even been receiving housing assistance, claiming you're a disabled veteran who needs specialized accommodation. The scope of the fraud was staggering. While I'd been serving my country in increasingly dangerous assignments, Lucy had been collecting thousands of dollars in benefits by claiming I was disabled, unemployed, and unable to serve. She had been profiting from my military service while simultaneously stealing everything I'd worked to build. The total fraud amount we can document exceeds $200,000, but that's just what we found in 3 weeks of investigation. The actual scope could be much larger. Captain Santos.
She played a recording from 2 weeks earlier, Lucy's voice clearly audible discussing my situation with someone she addressed as Tom. The Rodriguez case is working perfectly, Lucy said. Jessica's deployment schedule gives us at least 6 more months of access, and David's completely convinced that she's emotionally unavailable and planning to abandon him after her service ends. We should be able to clean out everything before she gets home. What about the family support benefits? Tom asked. Already maximized those. I've got her listed as having 3 dependent children and an elderly parent who needs medical care. The military sending over $3,000 a month in family support payments, plus the housing allowance and deployment bonuses. My hands were shaking as I listened to my sister discuss destroying my life like it was a business transaction. But the conversation continued with even more devastating revelations. The disability claims are processing well, too, Lucy continued. I've got her listed as having PTSD from a combat incident in 2021, plus a back injury from training accident. The Social Security payments started last month, and the VA disability benefits should kick in next month. How much are we looking at total? Tom asked. From the Rodriguez case? Probably $150,000 by the time we're finished. Between the house equity, the savings accounts, the fraudulent benefits, and the credit lines I've opened in her name, it'll be one of our bigger scores. Captain Santos paused the recording. Captain Rodriguez, do you need a moment before we continue? I did need a moment. Hearing Lucy discuss my life as a score and refer to me as a case rather than her sister was more devastating than the financial theft. She wasn't just committing crimes against me. She genuinely viewed me as a target rather than family. But Captain Santos wasn't finished revealing the scope of Lucy's criminal enterprise. The conversations we've recorded also include discussions about recruiting new associates and identifying future military targets, she said. Your sister appears to be actively involved in expanding this operation to target more deployed service members. She played another recording, this one from just days after Lucy and David's wedding. The military spouse benefits are incredible, Lucy was telling someone named Andrea. Once you marry the partner, you get access to everything. Commissary privileges, base housing if you want it, family support payments, even legal assistance. It's like having a military ID without actually having to serve. How do you find the targets? Andrea asked. Social media is perfect, Lucy replied. Military personnel post constantly about deployments, relationship challenges, family situations. You can identify vulnerable couples months before deployment starts, then position yourself as a helpful friend or family member. The deployed person is focused on staying alive, so they're not monitoring financial accounts or questioning power of attorney requests.
The recordings revealed that Lucy and her associates had been using social media, military family support groups, and base community events to identify potential targets and gather intelligence about their financial situations, relationship vulnerabilities, and deployment schedules. But the evidence that would ultimately destroy Lucy's operation came from an unexpected source: David himself. Captain Rodriguez, your former fiancé has been cooperating with our investigation for the past 2 weeks, Captain Santos said. I was stunned. David had betrayed me, married my sister, and participated in stealing everything I owned. Why would he suddenly cooperate with military investigators? It appears that David Chen was also being manipulated and exploited by your sister's operation, Captain Santos explained. He believed he was genuinely in love with Lucy and that the relationship developed naturally during your deployment. What he didn't know was that Lucy had been systematically manipulating him for years as part of a planned operation to access your assets. Captain Santos showed me text messages between Lucy and David that revealed the true nature of her relationship with David. David's completely hooked, one message read. He thinks I fell in love with him because he's special, but really I've been working him for 2 years. He's signed everything I've asked for and given me access to all of Jessica's accounts. He's the perfect, useful idiot. Are you going to keep him after the operation is complete? Tom had asked. Hell no. Once we've extracted everything from the Rodriguez case, I'll dump David and move on to the next target. He's sweet, but he's not smart enough to be a long-term partner in the business. When David discovered these messages during a security sweep of Lucy's phone, she'd asked him to retrieve something while she was in the shower, he realized that his marriage to her was as fraudulent as everything else about the operation. David came to military legal assistance voluntarily, Captain Santos explained. He brought copies of documents Lucy had asked him to sign, recordings of conversations where she'd coached him on what to tell investigators, and evidence that she'd been using his identity to commit additional fraud. David's cooperation had provided investigators with insider access to Lucy's operation, including her methods, her associates, and her plans for future targets. Most importantly, he'd been able to provide real-time intelligence about Lucy's activities and communications, allowing federal agents to gather evidence that would have been impossible to obtain otherwise. The cooperation agreement requires David to testify against Lucy and her associates in exchange for reduced charges related to his unwitting participation in the fraud scheme. He's facing potential jail time, but significantly less than he would face as a co-conspirator rather than a manipulated victim. But the most satisfying revelation came when Captain Santos showed me the scope of the federal response to Lucy's crimes. Captain Rodriguez, this case has attracted attention from the FBI's Organized Crime Unit, the Social Security Administration's Fraud Division, the VA Inspector General's Office, and the Department of Defense's Criminal Investigation Command. Your sister's operation has been classified.
The evidence we've gathered includes over 400 hours of recorded conversations, thousands of fraudulent documents, and financial records showing over $2 million in losses to military personnel and federal benefit programs, Captain Santos continued. Your sister's case provided the breakthrough that allowed investigators to map the entire criminal network. But Captain Santos saved the most important news for last. Captain Rodriguez, federal prosecutors have approved arrest warrants for your sister and her primary associates. The arrests are scheduled to take place simultaneously across 6 states next Tuesday morning. Your sister will be charged with organized crime, identity theft, wire fraud, benefit fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The charges carried potential sentences of 25 to 40 years in federal prison. Lucy's criminal enterprise had finally attracted the attention it deserved, and the full power of federal law enforcement was being brought to bear on her destruction. What about David? I asked. David Chen will be arrested on reduced charges related to his participation in the fraud, but his cooperation agreement will likely result in a sentence of 3 to 5 years with possibility of parole. The prosecutors recognize that he was manipulated and exploited, even though he ultimately participated in criminal activities. Captain Santos then outlined the timeline for my return from deployment and participation in the federal prosecution.
The military has approved your early return from deployment for witness testimony and victim impact participation, she said. You'll be flown back to the United States next week to work with federal prosecutors in preparing the case against your sister's organization. But the most satisfying part of Captain Santos's briefing was her description of how the arrest would be conducted. Federal agents will execute search warrants simultaneously at your sister's residence, her associates' locations, and multiple financial institutions where fraudulent accounts have been identified, she said. The operation is designed to prevent destruction of evidence and ensure that all members of the criminal network are taken into custody before they can flee or communicate with each other. Lucy and her associates thought they were untouchable, that their systematic exploitation of deployed military personnel was too sophisticated for law enforcement to detect or prosecute. What they didn't understand was that targeting American soldiers created federal jurisdiction and brought the full resources of military and civilian law enforcement into the investigation. Captain Rodriguez, Captain Santos said, as our briefing concluded, your sister made a critical error when she decided to target deployed military personnel. The federal government takes crimes against service members very seriously, and the penalties are specifically designed to deter exactly this type of exploitation. As I sat in my bunk that night, processing everything Captain Santos had revealed, I realized that Lucy's betrayal had actually accomplished something she'd never intended. By targeting me for systematic exploitation, she'd exposed an entire criminal network that had been victimizing military families for years. My case had become the catalyst for a federal investigation that would protect dozens of other military families from the same exploitation Lucy had inflicted on me. The evidence gathered from her operation would be used to prosecute criminals across multiple states and potentially prevent millions of dollars in future fraud against deployed service members. Lucy thought she'd targeted the perfect victim, a deployed military officer who was too far away and too distracted to protect herself. What she'd actually done was target someone with access to military legal resources, federal investigative capabilities, and prosecutorial systems specifically designed to protect service members from exactly her type of crimes. The devoted sister who had been systematically destroying my life for years was about to learn that some people are protected by the full power of the United States government, and the penalties for targeting them are designed to ensure that criminal organizations like hers are completely destroyed. Standing in that communications bunker in Afghanistan, surrounded by the tools and weapons I used to protect American interests overseas, I realized that the most important battle I'd ever fought was about to begin back home in Texas, where military prosecutors and federal agents were preparing to teach my sister exactly what happens to people who prey on deployed American soldiers. The arrest operation began at 6 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, October 17, 2023, with federal agents simultaneously executing search warrants in Texas, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. I watched it unfold from the FBI field office in San Antonio, where I'd been flown directly from Afghanistan just 18 hours earlier to participate in what prosecutors called the largest military family fraud takedown in federal law enforcement history. Agent Patricia Williams, the FBI organized crime specialist leading the operation, had set up a command center with live feeds from all 6 arrest locations. I sat beside Captain Santos, watching as teams of federal agents surrounded houses, businesses, and financial institutions where Lucy's criminal network had been operating for over 3 years. Target Alpha is Lucy Rodriguez, your sister. She's considered the operational leader of the network, with direct involvement in at least 12 separate fraud cases against deployed military personnel. The house I was watching, my house, the one David and I had bought together with my combat pay, the house where Lucy and David had been living on money stolen from my deployment savings, the house where they'd planned their fraudulent marriage while I was dodging Taliban rockets in Afghanistan. Target Beta is David Chen, your former fiancé. He's cooperating with federal prosecutors, but he'll still be arrested to maintain operational security and prevent the other targets from suspecting his cooperation. At exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Time, Agent Williams gave the command that I had been waiting to hear for months. Execute all warrants. Simultaneously, take them down. Watching Lucy's arrest through the surveillance feed was the most satisfying moment of my military career. Federal agents surrounded the house I helped buy with my combat pay, the house where Lucy and David had been living on money stolen from my deployment savings, the house where they'd planned their fraudulent marriage while I was dodging Taliban rockets in Afghanistan.
The tactical team used a battering ram on the front door I'd walked through countless times during weekend visits home from military assignments. Lucy appeared in the doorway wearing a silk bathrobe I'd never seen before, probably purchased with money she'd stolen from my accounts, looking confused and terrified as federal agents swarmed past her into what used to be my home. "Lucy Rodriguez," Agent Williams's voice came through the surveillance audio, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, identity theft, and organized criminal activity. You have the right to remain silent." Through the aerial feed, I watched my sister, the woman who'd systematically destroyed my life while pretending to love and support me, being handcuffed in the front yard of the house she'd stolen from me. She was crying, pleading with the agents, claiming there had been some terrible mistake. But her tears meant nothing to me. I'd cried plenty of tears in Afghanistan when I discovered her betrayal. Now it was her turn. David's arrest was almost anticlimactic. He came out of the house voluntarily, his hands raised, looking relieved rather than surprised. His cooperation agreement had prepared him for this moment, and he knew that his arrest was largely theatrical, designed to maintain cover while the rest of Lucy's network was simultaneously taken down. But the real satisfaction came from watching the other arrest locations, where Lucy's criminal associates were being taken into custody with no warning and no preparation. Target Charlie was Thomas Brennan, Lucy's primary partner in the identity theft operation, arrested at his apartment in Denver while trying to flush financial documents down the toilet. Target Delta was Andrea Martinez, Lucy's recruiter, who'd been identifying vulnerable military couples through social media, arrested at a Starbucks in Atlanta where she'd been meeting with potential new victims. Target Echo was Dr. Michael Stevens, a corrupt physician who'd been providing false medical documentation to support fraudulent disability claims, arrested at his clinic in Jacksonville while examining a patient. Target Fox was Jennifer Walsh, ironically the same name as one of the deployed military victims, a paralegal who'd been creating false power of attorney documents, arrested at her law firm in Charlotte while preparing paperwork for another fraud case. Within 2 hours, federal agents had arrested 23 individuals across 6 states, seized over $800,000 in cash and assets, and confiscated thousands of documents, computers, and phones containing evidence of the systematic exploitation of deployed military personnel. "Captain Rodriguez," Agent Williams said as the arrest operation concluded, "this is the largest military family fraud network we've ever dismantled. Your case provided the breakthrough that allowed us to protect dozens of other military families from the same exploitation your sister inflicted on you." The scope of the criminal network was staggering. Over 40 deployed military personnel had been victimized, with total documented losses exceeding $3.2 million. The fraud had been operating for over 4 years, targeting service members deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and various training assignments around the world. But the most shocking discovery came during the search of Lucy's house, where federal agents found what prosecutors called the trophy room, a home office filled with detailed files on every military family they'd victimized, including photos, financial documents, and personal information stolen from service members who trusted their family members and romantic partners. "Your sister kept detailed records of every crime," Agent Williams explained, showing me photographs from the search. "She had files on 43 different military victims, organized by deployment location, fraud amount, and operational status. She treated stealing from deployed service members like a business, complete with profit and loss statements."
The files revealed the true scope of Lucy's sociopathy. She hadn't just targeted me out of sibling jealousy or opportunistic greed. She'd built an entire criminal enterprise around exploiting deployed military personnel, viewing American soldiers as nothing more than financial opportunities to be systematically harvested. My file was the largest, labeled Rodriguez Long-Term Project, and containing detailed plans for stealing everything I owned over a multi-year timeline. Lucy had been planning my financial destruction since I'd started dating David, mapping out strategies for gaining access to my accounts, my benefits, and my identity. But she'd also kept files on the other military families she destroyed, including detailed psychological profiles of the romantic partners she'd manipulated and the family members she'd convinced to participate in fraud schemes. Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, deployed to Syria, whose mother had been convinced to steal her daughter's disability benefits. Staff Sergeant James Miller, deployed to Iraq, whose brother had been manipulated into refinancing their jointly owned business and disappearing with the proceeds. Each file contained the same elements: detailed financial analysis, relationship vulnerabilities, deployment timelines, and strategic plans for maximizing theft while minimizing detection risk. Lucy had turned the systematic destruction of military families into a science, refining her methods with each new victim until she'd created what federal prosecutors called the most sophisticated military fraud network in recent history. The trial, when it finally came 8 months later, was a federal spectacle that put military family fraud on the national political agenda. Lucy and her associates were charged under the Organized Crime Control Act, the Military Family Protection Act, and multiple federal fraud statutes that carried maximum sentences of life in prison. Federal prosecutors, led by Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Martinez, presented a case.
Lucy's theft and betrayal occurred while I was serving in a combat zone where mental focus and emotional stability are literally matters of life and death, I replied. Discovering that my own sister had systematically stolen my identity and destroyed my personal relationships created psychological stress that compromised my effectiveness as a military intelligence officer and potentially endangered the soldiers under my command. The personal impact testimony was devastating, but the financial evidence was even more damning. Forensic accountants from the FBI's white-collar crime unit had traced every dollar Lucy's network had stolen, creating detailed flowcharts that showed how money had been moved from military family accounts into criminal enterprises across multiple states. David's testimony, delivered under his cooperation agreement, provided insider details about Lucy's methods and motivations that no other witness could have offered. His description of how Lucy had systematically manipulated him over 3 years, creating emotional dependence while positioning herself to steal everything I owned, was particularly powerful. Lucy told me that Jessica had become emotionally distant and career-obsessed during military service, David testified. She convinced me that Jessica was planning to leave me after her deployment ended, that I needed to protect myself financially and emotionally by building a relationship with someone who would actually be present in my life. "Did you believe these statements about Captain Rodriguez?" Prosecutor Martinez asked. "Completely," David replied. Lucy had detailed knowledge about military culture, deployment psychology, and relationship challenges that made her explanations seem credible. She positioned herself as the caring sister who was trying to protect both Jessica and me from a relationship that was doomed to fail because of military obligations. "When did you realize that Lucy had been manipulating you as part of a criminal scheme?" David's voice broke as he answered, "When I found text messages on her phone where she called me a useful idiot and discussed how she was planning to abandon me after stealing everything from Jessica. I realized that our entire relationship was fraudulent, that she'd never loved me, that I'd been used as a tool to destroy the woman I actually loved." The defense strategy was predictably desperate. Lucy's attorneys argued that she was a loving sister who'd been trying to protect David from an absent military girlfriend, that her financial activities were authorized by power of attorney documents I'd legitimately signed, and that her benefit claims were based on genuine concerns about my psychological welfare after combat deployment. None of it worked.
The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too systematic, the criminal network too sophisticated to be explained away as family loyalty or misguided concern. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all defendants. Judge Patricia Harrison, the same former military prosecutor who'd sentenced my brother Jake in the previous case I'd been involved with, delivered sentences that sent shockwaves through the criminal community that preys on military families. Lucy received 42 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, plus restitution of $1.8 million to the military families she'd victimized. Her primary associate, Thomas Brennan, received 35 years. The other network members received sentences ranging from 8 to 25 years, depending on their level of involvement and the scope of their individual crimes. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Harrison said during Lucy's sentencing, "You have committed crimes that strike at the heart of military family trust and national security. Your systematic exploitation of deployed service members represents not just individual greed, but a betrayal of the values that military families depend on for survival during dangerous overseas assignments." She continued, "The evidence shows that you viewed American soldiers as nothing more than financial opportunities to be exploited, that you built an entire criminal enterprise around destroying military families while those families were serving their country in combat zones. Your actions have damaged not just individual victims, but the broader trust that military personnel must have in their family support systems." David received 5 years in federal prison under his cooperation agreement with possibility of parole after 3 years. While his sentence was relatively lenient, he would emerge from prison as a convicted felon who'd lost his career, his reputation, and any possibility of rebuilding the life he'd destroyed through his participation in Lucy's crimes. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, couldn't undo the personal damage Lucy's betrayal had inflicted. The investigation and prosecution had consumed 2 years of my life, delayed my planned transition to civilian career, and permanently altered my relationship with our parents, who'd never fully accepted that their devoted daughter was actually a sophisticated criminal. More tragically, the psychological impact of discovering that my own sister had viewed me as nothing more than a financial target required years of therapy and counseling that continued long after the criminal proceedings ended. The betrayal by someone I'd loved and trusted completely had damaged my ability to form close relationships and had made me suspicious of people who claimed to care about my welfare. But the experience had also taught me something valuable about resilience, justice, and the importance of institutional support systems for military personnel. The Military Legal Assistance Program, the federal law enforcement resources, and the prosecutorial systems designed to protect service members had worked exactly as intended, providing protection and justice that would have been impossible to achieve through civilian legal channels. I remained in the Army for 3 additional years after Lucy's conviction, eventually retiring as a major with 24 years of honorable service. The experience of being victimized by military family fraud had given me unique insights into the vulnerabilities that deployed personnel face, and I'd use those insights to help other military families protect themselves from similar exploitation. In 2027, I established the Military Family Security Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provides education, legal assistance, and financial protection resources for military personnel and their families. The foundation works closely with military legal assistance offices, federal law enforcement agencies, and veterans organizations to prevent the type of systematic exploitation that Lucy's network had inflicted.
The work is deeply personal, but strategically important. Every military family we help protect represents a victory over predators who view American soldiers as nothing more than financial opportunities. Every case we prevent helps preserve the trust and family support systems that military personnel depend on for survival during dangerous overseas assignments. Lucy is currently serving her sentence at Federal Correctional Institution Waseca in Minnesota, with no possibility of release until 2065, when she'll be 78 years old. She'll spend the rest of her productive life in federal prison, which seems appropriate for someone who dedicated years to systematically destroying military families for personal profit. I don't visit her, don't write to her, and don't think about her, except when her case helps me protect other military families from similar predators. The woman who systematically destroyed my life while pretending to love me no longer exists in my emotional world, replaced by a cautionary example of what happens to people who target American soldiers for exploitation. Our parents eventually came to understand the scope of Lucy's crimes and the systematic nature of her betrayal, but the family relationships were permanently damaged by years of manipulation and the devastating revelation that their devoted daughter was actually a federal criminal. They live quietly in San Antonio now, maintaining minimal contact with me and never discussing the daughter who destroyed everything they thought they knew about family loyalty. The house in Austin, the one David and I had bought together, the one where Lucy had lived while stealing my identity, was seized as part of the federal asset forfeiture process and eventually sold to pay restitution to her victims. I used my share of the proceeds to establish the foundation and never looked back at the life Lucy had tried to steal. Today, I live in Colorado Springs, near several military installations where I work with active duty personnel and their families to prevent military family fraud. I'm married to Colonel James Mitchell, a fellow military officer who understands the unique challenges of military life and the importance of protecting service members from exploitation. We have 2 children who will grow up understanding that military service is both an honor and a responsibility, and that the people who target military families for exploitation are enemies of American national security who deserve no mercy or forgiveness. The question that haunts me isn't whether Lucy deserved the punishment she received. She deserved every year of her federal sentence. The question is whether I could have prevented her crimes if I'd recognized the warning signs earlier, if I'd been less trusting of someone who shared my blood but didn't share my values. But I've learned that you can't protect yourself from people who are skilled at exploiting trust and family loyalty, especially when you're serving your country in dangerous locations where family support is crucial for psychological survival. The only real protection is institutional. Legal systems, law enforcement resources, and prosecutorial tools designed specifically to protect military personnel from the people who would exploit their service for personal gain. Lucy thought she'd identified the perfect victims in deployed military personnel who were too far away and too distracted to protect themselves. What she didn't understand was that targeting American soldiers makes you an enemy of the United States government, and the penalties for that designation are designed to ensure that criminal networks like hers are completely destroyed. The devoted sister who'd been protecting everyone from my supposed selfishness ended up spending the rest of her life in federal prison, while the military officer she'd tried to destroy became an advocate for protecting other service members from exactly her type of predatory exploitation. Justice sometimes takes years to arrive, but when it comes for people who prey on American soldiers, it arrives with the full power of federal law enforcement and military legal systems designed to ensure that such crimes carry consequences severe enough to deter future exploitation. Lucy learned that lesson the hard way, and her 42-year sentence serves as a warning to anyone else who thinks military families are easy targets for criminal exploitation.